Hello everyone, this is Tristan McGough, and today we're considering an intermediate Selfology, Awakening to Conscious Transfinity. So we're going to be talking about layering the 10-dimensional self. Now, as I've spoken of before, in terms of the 7 intuitional ideas of self, which are these naturally arising pristine cognitions which we all have, they are, if you will, the framework by which we perceive the wholeness, bigness, and sphericality of the world. We're dealing with cognos, the conscious being, and here we're dealing with what has been called the for itself. And so consciousness as being for itself is necessarily always looking at itself as that perception, and it can attend to things through attention. And these things that it attends to, it can actually apprehend. So, in terms of these 10 dimensions, I've outlined them before, and if we were to interlace them, because they're all actually integrated and operating all at once within each of us. So if we look at these 10 dimensions, we're going to see that the first one is the observing self, or, if you will, the perspectival dimension. We all have a perspective on the world. In the finite world, we observe it through the body, and we use our sensory organs to hear with our ears, to see with our eyes, to taste with our mouth, to smell with our nose, and to touch with our bodies. However, besides having an external perspective on the world, we all have a very unique self-observational role, do we not? As being able to observe the contents of our own individual consciousness through intra-agency causality, the causality of the generative world of the psyche, the soul, what's often called in the big picture, the mind. So there's an internal perspective that one has on oneself, and this is often one's self-image, where you, as an I, project the me onto the screen of your self-awareness, and you see yourself in certain ways, the I, me. So this is all part of the observing dimension. But besides that, there's a living dimension, is there not? The living dimension that we know of is this bodily self, this living dimension with, Aristotle noticed 5 sense organs, and these are usually ones that we list, and I already just did. And those are your passive sensors in this world, but you have active sensors as well, right? The ability to manipulate with your hands, the ability to ambulate with your feet, the ability to digest and eliminate food, and to procreate and to speak. These are all active senses. However, it's interesting to see that scientists collectively today, some of them have as many as 30 or better sensors, including your chemical receptors in your taste buds, but as well other sensors, such as the sense of equilibrium in the body, or proprioception, which is the internal sensibilities you have from the neurons feeding back information to your brain internal to your own body, etc. So the bodily self, let us just say, has these active and these passive sensors, and that's part of the living dimension that you have. But besides that, we all know we have a feeling dimension, do we not? And it isn't as if your bodily dimension goes away when you have feelings. No, it's a dimension that's already layered there, in the same way that You have a perspective on your feelings. You either feel sorry for yourself, or you're very prideful, or you're neutral to various things that you witness in your own inner scape, the way you see yourself. Are you guilt-ridden? Are you somebody who's overly confident? Are you somebody who's able to take on the world with a sense of resilience and realize that sometimes you're up and sometimes you're down, but you're always who you are, whether up or down? So the emotional or feeling aspect of the self is another dimension of consciousness. And when one awakens to one's own consciousness, when one awakens to one's own awareness, one is necessarily utilizing all 10 of these dimensions, and that's called self-realization. So besides having the observing, the feeling, and the bodily dimensions, we have a narrating one, do we not? It's that voice goes on in your head, and it's the voice by which you are doing your intellectual calculations and adding sums up or composing a poem. That narrative self is the intellectual dimension that we all have. And besides that, we have a volitional self, which is our willing dimension. It's quite different because we can will ourselves to do something that we don't necessarily feel or think we should do at the time. It's something that we may will our bodies to do what our body is just adverse to do. Perhaps exercise for an extra length of time or to press yourself past your personal best. Doesn't matter what it is. The point is you have all these dimensions that are interacting, and the volitional self is another one. Then you come to the social self. Very unique self. This is an imaging dimension. More correctly, it's an imagining dimension. It's not just taking an image and reproducing it. It is using the imagination actively in order to recreate the world in some kind of imageal pattern that we all have. And this imaging capacity is identical to the social capacity. That is, we can only imagine that in which we stand to have a relationship, an I and a thou. And some of us extend that to even animals or to plants or to even inanimate objects in which you can very well see that there's a polarity of I and of thou, and of treating something as if it is a sacred part, which it is, of the whole. And that is precisely what you're doing in terms of this social dimension. And right now it's rudimentary. We feel great when we're introduced to somebody who's very positive and who has a chemical affinity with us psychologically. However, we realize that very often we don't have chemistries that mix with other people, and we have to find the ingredients that alleviate a combustible possibility. So that's all part of the social self in the imagining dimension. And then you have the enduring self, which is the continuing dimension. As I often say, you don't wake up to a different person, do you, in the morning? When you look in the mirror, even though your body has changed, you never for a moment think that your consciousness has not continued. That continuing dimension is another of the 10 dimensions of consciousness. And then there's the unifying dimension. That's your organizing self. That's that part of yourself that can take feelings and thoughts and deep emotions and superficial emotions and the sounds you hear and the deep cravings that you have and the intense goal orientation that you're striving to attain to. All of that is unified. That unifying or organizing dimension is another integral dimension of your consciousness. And then, besides the unifying, there is the advancing. This is the presencing dimension. This is the dimension in which at all times you inhabit and you see that there is a present moment, there are present objects, There's a presentivity, that is, the quality of something being present is here, making this an actuality. And then there's what? The presenting. There is some manner in which things are presenting themselves in order to make for the whole package of the presentation. Well, the presentation is the wind-up. The pitch is that everything that is in this presencing self are the treasures that are utilized and tapped in order to become the advancing self. The advancing self is where you, through self-mastery, make contributions that are meritorious to the world around you that last. And the last dimension is the dimension of the one self. It's the identifying dimension. It's the dimension that identifies us each as an individuality, but an individuality that has an identity. What identity? I am I. I, the self. Not a single thing, having 10 dimensions. It is multifaceted, but yet it is a single thing, as we discovered. By awakening to our own consciousness, we see that it is this naked consciousness in the moment, stripped of a dead past, forlorn of an ever-receding future that is always unproduced. The production of that future in the moment is the present. And it is tying the past to the future through the present. And that is, of course, the Ausic cross of space, time, cause, and entities. Now, these 10 dimensions that we all have as our essential being are things that we wish to develop and unfold and achieve even further states of by the process of awakening. Now, I've referred to these 10-dimensional self, and I broke them down in terms of causation. But however, before we actually had done that, I talked about the vectorized involutionary arc. In other words, you've got your basic dimensions that are the self, and I've spoke of them before. You know, the self is intuition, and it operates by the mode of intuition. That's your self at the center. And then over here, for instance, if we were to talk about some kind of geometry to this, here's the mind. And then over here in front is the will. And behind it is the heart, and over here is doing. So you have doing and thinking and feeling and willing. And at the center, you have intuiting. That's the center of it all. That center, when it involutes into space-time, the causal network of entities, you have the living dimension and the feeling dimension and the identifying and the willing and the thinking dimension. This identifying here is the intuiting dimension, I mentioned. You have these, if you will, expand into your psyche, the epistic self with the epistemic relation, where everything is always a subject-object along this relational path. Husserl referred to it as the universal subject-object correlation. It's always there. It's a form of consciousness at the epistic self level. It's what identifies your transcendental self, the self that's able to lift itself above the world and to say, you know what, I think I'll build a canal over there, or I'll dig a ditch here, or I'll remove that here. You could do interagency causation out here productively in the world because you have intra-agency causation going on here in your psychical world. And in that psychical world, that's where it converges in this organoverse, in this universe that tends to amalgamate and massify. And you have, therefore, this identifying dimension takes on this observing dimension, so that you actually are able to pivot in a finite world through your transfinite experiencing. And then what else do you have? You have, from the angle of thinking, that becomes an organizing or the unifying dimension. In the same way that in terms of your living dimension, that becomes the enduring or the continuing dimension, right? Your life is continuous. And when it stops being continuous in this body, we call it organic death. And then your social, we talked about this, feeling dimension becomes your imaging, your imagining dimension, the social dimension in which you are able to interact through the images that you produce of the world that allow you to replicate that world and respond and pivot through those images. You don't just simply react to the world in some animal, pre-human, cognitional form. You are able to utilize the entire inventory at your disposal in your own innerscape as your psychical world and respond appropriately through your imagining dimension. And in the same way, we have the willing dimension that is the presenting dimension here in this world where everything in the present are brought together, and in the present you have the presented object, you have the present moment, you have the presenting, and you have the presentivity, the actual quality of presenting or presencing being there. That's all there in presencing. That's what the present looks like. It's a present. It's a gift from the universe to you, to me. Each of us has a present, right? And when we unpack that present, we find that we have these other dimensions that expand from the original 5 of the self. So, besides reflecting and thinking and feeling and doing and willing, you have the other dimensions that emerge. In the evolutionary arc, what you are doing is you are using your fundamental dimensions, your bodily or living dimension, your feeling dimension, and these are all now anchored and based right here in the empiric self, up through the epistic self to your gnostic self. Spirit, soul, and soma, right? The spirit, the soul, and the body or the personality, if you will. These are now on an upward tending arc, an evolutionary arc, and that is the point in which you have the creation of the socioverse through the unifying, the imaging, this synergic, which is this intuitive level, now amplified through advancement, and the social as well as the continuing dimensions that are in operation. So you see, from the original or the base powers of self, the basic powers of self, of intuiting, thinking, feeling, doing, and willing, you have emerged through the process of evolution, involution and evolution to be exact, these other 5. Now altogether, taking the 10, I've spoken of this 3-part causational contribution to creation. Creation is not just a production of one finite thing from another. It also is generation. It's the intra-agent causality. It's that allows, that's what transfinity is. Transfinity is where you are inscribing by universal energies, infinite energies, actual finite events. You are creating a ontological signature in the world. It is infinite, but at the same time, it is not all of infinity. Infinity is ever-ending, and your transfinity is one of those infinities within it, in the same way that the subset of even numbers continue to infinity. They are a subset of whole numbers, which includes all the whole numbers, right? From 0 to infinity. It's a subset of that, even though it's infinite. And that's what your personal or psychical transfinity is. It is an inscription of infinity into the finite world. That inscription is done through productive causation, and here's where the empiric self is with the level of production. And this is where things have a function. One thing affects something else, effects it. One is a cause to something else. So, in terms of our 10 dimensions, what interacts with the world around us is your perspectival self, your bodily self, and your social self. This imagining self. It's always projecting itself in the world. In fact, the contours of your conduct and behavior follow the outlines of your imagination as you interact as a social being. Remember, as a social being, we have 24 different personae of your orchestral personality. These are adaptive roles that you as a transfinite being, as a conscious transfinite being, assume in this empirical, social, finite world. And so the three interagency energies that we interact as an ecologue, we interact with the natural and the social world, are through our social self, our perspectival self, and of course our bodily self. Now, in terms of the transfinity of the intra-agency causation, which I've termed generation, where the I generates an idea of itself as well as everything else, along this epistemic bifurcation, this epistemic relation of subject and object, this has 5 dimensions. It, of course, has the enduring or continuing self, along which are strung the volitional self, the feeling self, right? The thinking self, and the unifying self. These selves, these dimensions, this organizing dimension, this continuing dimension, plus your willing and your thinking and your feeling, are all part of what creates this generative causation in the intrapsychic world of your own experience. Now, when it comes to what grounds both that intra-psychic experience as well as your inter-active events in a finite world is this greater scape. And that is here the Gnostic emanation. It all emanates at once. It's not as if one thing comes into being and then another thing comes out. It's all here at once. And all this is a variegation, a variation and a variegation upon a theme, a cosmic theme of ontos, of being, of which conscious being is perhaps the most potent of the forms of being, related here in Transfinity, unfolding the rest. But in terms, and remember here where we have this as intra-agency for your epistic self and its inter-agency for your personality or your empiric self out here in the finite world, you can affect things. Well, there's a trans agency that takes place. The trans agency, this type of causality, is what creates infinity. Everything, it's not comprehended rationally, because rational means to make into ratios, right? But there are irrational numbers. In the same way, there are irrational ideas, and that's why consciousness is an irreality. It can entertain paradoxes. Not only entertain them, it thrives by ambiguity. It lives by ambiguity and bifurcation. It lives by syzygy, dyadity, and duality, and it's always diversifying. And this is the nature of the ecologue. There's always some new speech that's going on. However, the egologue, that are these 5 dimensions that are, if you will, speaking to one another, this egologue, that is my will, my thoughts, my feelings. This is my organized psyche. This is my continuing consciousness. You see, that's all intra-agency causality. In the same way, then, that you have for trans-agent causality across all of it is the advancing self and the identifying self. We're all identified with the same thing, and identity is identity. The very same identity that I call upon in myself is the very same identity you call upon in yourself. There's no difference. It is what stamps our individuality in the existential world. That sounds like a paradox, and of course it is, and you can only understand it through paradoxical logic, where you are at the same time as a transfinity able to operate as the magician does in the tarot card with infinity on his crown. And he's reaching to infinity and he's passing it down to infinity. That's transfinity. And this transfinity itself, when we take it and we look at it, is a cauldron. These 10 dimensions are actually what are all involved in creating the microcosmic trinity, the trigonic self of what? Deity, human, and creature. That's all of us. We, all of us, have our untapped potential, and that is our daemonic side, just as we have our demonic side, which down here are where consciousness binds itself to infinity. That is the demon in each of us. The demon is nothing more than the energies that you have locked into place to interact reactively with the world along the lines of least resistance. It's not to be confused with the trickster of your consciousness, which appears in myths, in which calls you into a new form of organization because it one way or another disrupts the unified whole that you have. And that's why it's a trickster. It makes you understand that paradox is endemic to the human situation. It is not something that you transcend. It is something that you reconcile yourself to and are resolved through recognition. That is through awakening and recognizing that the past is gone, the future is not yet here, and all there is this single instant, which is an ephemeral moment in the eternal now. All of that here is happening as a cauldron in which you as a human being have the power to take the infinite aspects of deity and pull them down into new creations as a creature in this finite world. In other words, these 10 dimensions are really the form of vectors, if you will, that converge in order to create your experience within the world. Now remember, in terms of experience, you have Experia, that is all these different doings and thinkings and feelings and willings that we could bust up, if we'd like, into 4 major groups. And we can relate them to the thinkings of the mind and the feelings or the qualia of the heart. And we can think of them as the vidya or the active components, the doings of the life aspect, in the same way that everything that relates to a goal, that relates to purpose, is part of Talia, part of the will aspect. And all of these together, remember, are operating under the agency of your watcher, who is also an actor, because there's no perception that you're having that you are not also performing a function of perceiving. Perceiving is the perception. You are conscious as you are conscious of the things in your world. But all of that is happening as what? As part of the crucible of experience. All of this comes together. And you distill through these 3 different levels of causation. The 2 emanational, of advancing and the identifying, the 5 generational, and the 3 productional. All of these together give you an alembic, as the alchemist used to refer to it, in which You mix the ingredients of reality. You mix infinity with finity, that is the infinite being or pure being, with finite being as conscious being, carving it all up through non-being. So, until the next time that we meet, behave when you must. Be good whenever you can, but above all else, be yourself.